Hello again, everybody. I'm Rob Mize, and today I would like to share with you a technique I call Shatter MATION, using After Effects Shatter Effect to animate text, logos, and other objects. Once you've got the hang of balancing the Shatter Effects force and physics, you'll be surprised what you can do. So let's get started. Let's create a new comp, and we'll call this Shatter MATION. And let's add a new text layer that we'll call Shatter MATION. And I want this text to be white and no border there. Now let's add our simulation shatter effect. Let's change our view to rendered, our shape to custom, and our custom shatter map to our layer, Shatter MATION. And there we go. Now we want to do more than just blow that text off screen. So we want to get some control over that. And we can use the force and the physics to do that very thing. Let's take a quick look at this. If we change this back to our wireframe and forces view, we can see our shatter map made up of our text, and we can see this circle that represents the force shattering this object. We see that if we move the depth, that we move that force back in Z space, and it no longer contacts our object and no longer shatters it. Let's take a look at this from a different angle. We can open up our camera position, and you can see we can change that so that we can see our force in relation to our object. Now, instead of using the camera position controls down here, I like to use the comp camera. So I'm going to select that and create a new camera. 35mm will do. And instead of using this active view, I'm going to select a custom view and move this around so I can see what's happening with my force relative to the object that I'm shattering. Quick tip here, you can use the escape key to toggle back and forth between the last two views that you've used. So that's a quick way to change that and to avoid clicks. And as I've said before, until I'm paid by the click, I'm really into reducing how many I have to do. As we change back to our custom view, we see that as we change our depth, that our shatter effect occurs as our shattering force makes contact with the object. This lighter blue represents the center of the force. So if that center is in front of our object, let me adjust the depth accordingly, you'll see that it pushes the object back instead of forward. I'm going to come down here and take this gravity to 0 so that we see more of that force and what's happening to it. And let's move our depth back to where it was so that now the center is behind our object and now the force pushes the object forward. Now we can also animate our position of the force. You see, if we move it over on the x-axis, we can bring it over, and as it contacts the various parts of the object, it's shattered. Same with the vertical position. The radius, we can reduce that so that the force doesn't exist at all, or it just creates contact with whatever portion of the object we want and shatters only that part. And then the strength will determine how far and how fast the object is shattered. We have a second force which acts just like the first, and can be used in concert with force 1 to get a variety of interesting effects. I'm going to take that down to 0 for now. We can assign a gradient layer and animate the gradient shatter threshold in order to drive the progression of the shatter effect. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later. The physics control, you see we have rotation speed. We can bring that to 0 for no rotation. Or we can increase that as much as we want. We can determine what axes the object tumbles on. We can determine the randomness of the shatter effect. Viscosity, think of that as the thickness of the atmosphere. If we bring that up, we see that our object does not shatter as far, and in fact comes so far and then stops. And you can balance this with the strength to get a variety of effects and control over the shatter process. Also, gravity. Let's turn gravity up. It's just what you think it is. It's the attractive force, but it doesn't have to pull down. You see that gravity can be in any direction here, all 360 degrees. Gravity inclination, think of that as gravity pulling toward the camera or away from the camera. Minus 90 is away from the camera. 90 and the positive value is toward the camera. We also have some textures that we can apply. We can use the layer as it is, or we can apply color here. Let's take a look at our rendered view to see that. Okay, let's change that to color. And now we see color on the face of our objects. We can also add that to the side and the back. We can also add a texture by choosing layer and then designate what layer we want that to be. And I'll show you how that works in just a few minutes. Also, we have lighting and material controls that let us further refine the look of our object. So I thought I would do something a little different. Instead of asking you to endure countless adjustments of parameters, I thought I would just open up this composition that I prepared, and let's take a look at that. So let's start with this first one, the basic shatter. We come forward and boom, it shatters off the screen. Simple enough. All we did there was just apply the basic shatter, and the custom shatter map is, again, the layer that we're actually using. This has a positive strength to the force, and here I've assigned the color to both the front side and back layers and made my lighting adjustments for the look that I want. Roughen edges, I did not use that. Now, quite frequently, I hear that someone wants the shatter to fall into place. Rather than being shattered out of position, they want the object to fall into position. And that is easy enough. Let's duplicate this layer and open up our time stretch controls and come here and change this stretch factor to -100. And I'll just put current frame there and hit my left bracket to bring that starting point where my cursor is. Okay, we're just looking at our basic Shatter 2 layer here, and as we come forward we will see that our shatter falls into place like so. Now I need a little more of a layer here, so I'm just going to extend this, and there we go. And if you want to adjust the timing on that, just slide this layer where you want it and extend it out as far as you need. And there you go. You have your reverse shatter. Now this next effect we're going to look at in the wireframe view so we can see what's going on. We have our shatter force animating from left to right. And we can see that if I select my custom view there, now I can change it back and forth. We can see that we have a very large radius on our force and that it is moving from left to right. And as it does, the very front of that force contacts the letters progressing from left to right. And as it contacts them, the shatter effect moves them forward. Now let's look at our settings here. You'll see we have no rotation speed, so the letters aren't tumbling. We have just a little bit of gravity and gravity inclination at 90 degrees, which is pulling the object toward the camera. Let's look at that from our active camera view. And that's a nice transition. All right, as we continue, let's take a look at this next effect, and we'll see that it starts forward and then is pulled back by gravitational force. And if we look at that again, we'll see it starts there, is blown forward, and then pulled back by gravity that is minus 90 in gravity inclination and a little over 3.2 in force of gravity. Now on this one, we're animating our position from left to right, and we have a negative strength there, so that as the force comes across and contacts each one of these letters, the negative strength pulls it up toward the center of the force and then on out the other side. And we have just a little bit of tumble on the y-axis. And I have just a bit of gravity direction applied, because without that, you see, let's get that at 0, the letters are pulled at an angle again toward the center of the force here. So by having just a little bit of gravity there to adjust it more in a vertical position. Now this is very similar, also using negative strength, and the force animates from left to right. And as it does, it pulls the letters over, but then we see that they stop. And this is due to the viscosity. If we increase that viscosity, we see that we would get less movement there, and of course with no viscosity, it would come right off screen. But as it is, our letters slide to the left and then hold their position. Now, this is kind of interesting. You see these artifacts here, and this is a consequence, I believe, of the shading that the shatter effect does to achieve part of the 3D effect. And if we see our color here, you'll see that as we change that color, that artifacting changes. If we have pure white, we have no artifacts, and the same with pure black. These other colors, however, seem to vary according to their particular shading. Now, another interesting thing to note is that the brightness, if it's less than 50%, you have no artifacting. So we can see that if we just look at the layer, there is that color of our text, but in this case, I've chosen to color the text with this texture control right here. And you may wish to have that artifacting, those extra elements blast out, or you may want to do without them. Now, this next one I really like. What we have here is black text with a white stroke around it. And I've checked this white tiles fixed. And what that will do, that will keep the white part of the object in position while the rest of it blasts out, like so. So the text shatters out and the outline stays in place. And you could reverse that like so. But I like this original effect a little bit better. Here again, we're looking at the wireframe plus the forces, and we have negative strength here. And the shatter effect pulls these letters back toward its center, almost as if it's collapsing into a black hole or something. And I have have gravity inclination minus 90 that is accelerating that pull backward in z-space. So that negative strength along with that negative gravity inclination pulls those letters back into z-space. You can be quite precise with this effect, as we see here. I brought the radius down quite small, 0.01, and a little bit of strength there. You see I have depth at 0, the same position that the letters are. And I'll show you how we did this. As we come forward, we see our force animating around, popping each one of these letters individually. And if I duplicate this layer and open it, hit U to reveal those keyframes, you'll see I have a series of hold keyframes here, animating the position and the depth. And what I did, I started out with just these first 3 keyframes. Again, in position on the letter S and a depth of 0. And then I pull the depth back to 0.3. We can see that it is not in contact with the letters, and so it's not affecting them. But here in this first series of keyframes it is. So what I did is I copied these using Command C, and then came ahead 10 keyframes using Command Shift right arrow key, and then I paste those 3 keyframes in this position. And as I come over this locator here, you see my cursor changes to an arrow, and I can move that locator where I want it. And I'll come ahead again, 10 keyframes, and paste again, and I'll move this force where I want it. And then I'll come ahead 10 keyframes, paste again, and I'll once again move this force and bring this to the next position. Come ahead 10 keyframes, paste again. So you get the idea of what we're doing here. And this really isn't that tedious. You can move along through this pretty quickly. So as I noted, you can get quite precise. You could further affect this motion by changing the physics. You might decide to put 0 rotation on it and maybe give it a little gravity, and you could just have those individually drop out like so, or bring that gravity around where they fly up out of the frame. Now shapes work just the same as text does. The custom shatter map is once again the layer that we're using, and in this case we have animated the radius so that it goes from 0 to a value of 0.4. And as that radius increases, it first contacts the star, then the oval, and then these 2 shapes at the side. And remember that the shatter map uses color to determine the shape of the shatter. So it's getting the color from the actual object. We are not using textures to color this object. That is the color that these shapes were assigned originally. I think you'll like this effect. Here we have our text in place. It's pulled to the right by negative strength and then collides with force 2 and appears to ricochet off our metal panel there. Let's take a look at our wireframe and forces. And I'll turn off this metal panel that we got from cgtextures.com. And if we come way out, you can see our 2 forces there. The smaller one is force 1 with negative strength, again pulling our text in toward its center. This force 2 has positive strength, so that when the letters collide with that force 2, they're bounced back in the direction that they came from. Now, this animation is driven by this gradient layer that you see right here. And if we go up to gradient, you'll see we've assigned linear gradient, this layer, as our gradient to drive our shatter threshold. And if we look at that, we can see that it starts at 0, and then our shatter threshold increases until it has shattered the entire object. And here it goes from white to black. The progression of the shatter follows the gradient. Now we could invert that, and it would go from black to white, as so. So you see, you really can get some sophisticated motion going by combining these various elements. Now this shadow that you see, the way I like to do these shadows is I simply duplicate my text layer. Once I have everything set up the way I want it, I duplicate that layer, then pre-comp that layer, then make it a 3D layer, hit AA to reveal my material options, and change that to cast shadows only. And we get that effect. All I need is a sound effect there of these letters clanging against that metal. Now finally, let's take a look at this last layer, and we see that we have, in this case, applied a texture to the front, side, and back layer of this object. And there you see we've assigned this as layer, and then we've chosen this wood rough layer that we have here. And once again, that's from our friends at cgtextures.com. And in this case, we have also added a shatter map that we'll take a look at. And what we have here, if I turn this track mat off, you'll see that we have a solid with fractal noise applied and then colorama applied to this. And as I mentioned before, it is the distinction in color that determines the shape of the shatter on that particular object. And this shatter map is getting its shape from this text as we assign the track mat to the alpha mat of Shatter MATION text, like so. We'll go back to our Shatter MATION comp, and as we come forward, we see that our shatter begins, those small little pieces created by our shatter map, and the shape of the shatter and the progression of it is driven by our gradient radial, right there. Again, we're starting at white and progressing to the darker. And just as we did before, should we choose to do so, we can invert that gradient and go from the darker to the lighter. So there you have it. You really should see Jesse Tula's tutorial on custom shatter maps for an in-depth understanding of shatter effect in general and shatter maps in particular. He does a great job of explaining that. So I'm sure you get the idea that as you adjust these various parameters, there are countless ways you can animate objects using the shatter effect. When you come up with something you're particularly proud of, share it. I'd love to see how you're using this. So have fun with Shatter MATION, and by the way, I do claim copyright privileges on that term. So until next time, this is Rob Mize, and as always, wishing you happy compositing.